He won the greatest electoral victory of his era. He opened doors that had been closed between Washington and Beijing. He negotiated with yesterday's enemies, and shifted the balance of the Cold War. But he couldn't negotiate with his fear. He didn't fall because he was stupid. He fell because he was smart enough to think he was smarter than the system. Watergate wasn't a fleeting moment of weakness. It was the result of a mind accustomed to seeing the world as a battlefield. And the harsh truth, the most dangerous thing about power, isn't corruption. It's the belief that you can control everything. And history doesn't bring down leaders just because of their mistakes, but because of the pattern they repeat to the end. In 1972, one man won 49 out of 50 states. A landslide victory, a near absolute popular mandate. America was in his hands. But just 2 years later, he would walk through the White House door for the last time. Not because he lost an election, not because he lost a war, but because he lost control. Richard Nixon was no ordinary politician. He was a brilliant strategist. He redrawn the map of the Cold War. He opened the door to communist China. He manipulated the global balance of power. But at the same time, he was a man who lived in a constant state of suspicion. He recorded calls. He monitored his opponents. He feared betrayal. And in the end, it wasn't the opposition that brought him down. His recordings did. Richard Nixon was born in 1913 in a small town in California, into a modest Quaker family. Discipline, austerity, and moral guilt, these were not his later political ideals. It was a daily upbringing. But the problem wasn't just poverty. 2 of his brothers died of tuberculosis. He witnessed death within his own home. He saw his mother exhausted, grieving, sometimes harsh in her silence. And his father was strict, pragmatic, and unemotional. Here, the first complex was formed. A child who wanted to prove he was the strongest, in a home that taught him emotion was a weakness. He wasn't the handsome one in school. He wasn't the most popular. But he was academically top of his class. He noticed the pattern early on. If you can't win love, win excellence. He dreamed of attending Harvard. He was accepted academically, but his family couldn't afford it. So he stayed close to home at Whittier College. And here, a deep sense of deprivation took root. I'm good enough, but circumstances are always against me. This feeling would haunt him politically for years. A feeling that he was always fighting the elite. That he was an outsider in a world that didn't want him in. Father. Frank Nixon. He was a farmer. Then a small shop owner. A tough, direct man. He didn't believe in pampering. He failed at more than one venture. He saw life as a daily struggle for survival. He wasn't affectionate. He believed that a man was made through discipline and strictness. This type of father instills 2 things: an immense desire to prove himself, a constant fear of failure. Nixon learned from his father that the world doesn't give you anything, you have to seize it. Mother. Hannah Milhous Nixon. She came from a family of German-Dutch descent. She was a Quaker. Her personality was quiet. She was religious. She had strong moral discipline. But she experienced severe trauma. She lost 2 children to tuberculosis. Nixon was the closest to her emotionally. He saw her endure her pain in silence. And here an internal paradox was formed: the father's rigidity, the mother's silence, a combination that created a man who doesn't show his weakness. He doesn't trust easily. He considers emotions a burden. Social background: he didn't come from an aristocratic family. He wasn't from the East Coast elite. He wasn't from the traditional Ivy League, which had dominated Washington for decades. He was from the rural middle class in California. And this is very important, because when he later entered politics, he always felt like an outsider among the elite. This feeling of alienation would later manifest strongly in his conflict with the media, and in his belief that there was a conspiracy against him. It is in his youth that the transformation from a feeling inferior child to a man who masters confrontation begins. A fighting mind is formed. After graduating from Whittier College, Richard Nixon received a scholarship to Duke University Law School. At Duke, he wasn't from a wealthy family. He worked hard to prove he deserved his place. He joined the legal debate teams. He excelled academically. He graduated at the top of his class. Observe the pattern again. Not the most popular, but the most prepared. This youth didn't cultivate charisma, it cultivated a strategic mind. During World War II, he served in the U.S. Navy. He wasn't a field hero on the front lines, but he worked in logistics and supply. He didn't learn heroism, he learned organization, and control, and reading numbers, and managing systems. These are skills that would later appear in his political style. He loves information. He relies on files. He builds long-term strategies. As for his personal life, he married Pat Ryan in 1940. She was a quiet partner, supportive, and resilient, but the relationship wasn't a show of romanticism. It was pragmatic, like his personality. In his youth, a clear belief took root within him. If I am not loved, I will be effective. And here begin the traits of a politician who doesn't rely on popularity, relies on planning, doesn't trust easily, and prepares for the blow before it comes. After World War II, Richard Nixon didn't return to a quiet life. He entered politics in 1946, running for the House of Representatives against a veteran Democratic incumbent. He didn't run as a gentleman. He ran as an attacker. He accused his opponent of communist sympathies in the post-war climate, where fear of the Soviet Union was rapidly escalating. It was a clever and ruthless blow, and he won. This is how his unofficial nickname began to take shape, a politician who doesn't hesitate to use attack as a weapon. He entered Congress and became a prominent member of the Committee to Investigate Communist Activities. And then came a pivotal moment, the Alger Hiss affair. Who was Alger Hiss? He was a high-ranking official in the U.S. State Department and participated in the Yalta Conference after World War II. In other words, he wasn't a low-level employee, he was from within the political elite. The accusations began in 1948, and a man named Whittaker Chambers told a congressional committee that Hess had been a member of a Soviet spy network in the 1930s. At the time, the accusation was huge and serious because the Cold War had begun, and fear of communism was rising. This is where Nixon got involved. He was a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee. Instead of ignoring the issue like many others, he decided to push hard. What exactly did Nixon do? He didn't just treat the issue as a media statement. He followed up on the investigation personally. He pressed for evidence. He confronted Hess publicly. Chambers presented documents that he said were classified copies leaked to the Soviets. These later became known as the Pumpkin Papers. Hess denied everything, but the legal problem was that the statute of limitations had expired on the espionage charges. So he was tried for perjury. And in 1950, he was convicted. Why is this case so important? For two contradictory reasons. First, for Nixon's supporters, he was the man who exposed a Soviet infiltration within the government. He is considered a national hero who stood against the Red Menace. Second, for his critics, he was a politician who exploited anti-communist hysteria to advance his political career. He employed smear tactics and media pressure. And here begins the pattern that would accompany him, fighting without hesitation. Using the threat as a political tool, believing that adversaries were not merely opponents, but an existential threat. And the deeper question, was Nixon historically correct? Documents that later surfaced after the opening of Soviet archives, Project Venona, indicated that Hess was indeed linked to spy networks. But the way Nixon handled the issue, aggressive, confrontational, and public, is what created his controversial image. The big leap in 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower chose him to be his vice president. An ambitious young man. From humble beginnings, he suddenly stands beside a World War II hero. But even here, he faced an early crisis. Accusations of opaque political funding. He responded with a famous televised address known as the Checkers Speech. He didn't apologize. He didn't back down. He fought back publicly before the people. And he survived. What is being formed here? An offensive mindset, a willingness to exploit political fear, a constant sense of being in a battle, a belief that if he doesn't attack, he will be attacked. In 1960, Richard Nixon ran for president against the charismatic young John F. Kennedy. And then something happened that changed the course of his life entirely. The first televised presidential debate in American history. In the televised debate, Nixon appeared tired and unwell. He refused to wear makeup. He looked pale, nervous, and uncomfortable in front of the camera. Kennedy appeared calm, confident, and smiling. Those who listened to the debate on the radio said that Nixon had the stronger argument. But those who watched it on television saw the exact opposite. And here Nixon learned a bitter lesson. Politics is no longer about arguments, it's about image. And he lost the election by a very narrow margin. Was it election theft? Nixon believed there were irregularities in crucial states like Illinois and Texas. He could have filed a formal challenge and perhaps plunged the country into a constitutional crisis. But he didn't. Publicly, he said he didn't want to expose the country to instability. But internally, a deeper feeling took root. The system wasn't playing fair. And this was a dangerous psychological moment. In 1962, he ran for governor of California, and lost again. At a famous press conference, he uttered his infamous line to the journalists, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." He was furious. He felt targeted by the media. He felt despised by the elite. And here something new was taking shape. Not just an ambitious politician, but a man who felt trapped. The crucial point, the 1960 loss wasn't just an electoral defeat. It was a psychological rupture. From that moment on, his distrust of the media intensified. His sense of conspiracy grew. He came to believe he had to build a small circle of trust. And that he had to control the media narrative at all costs. And here the seeds of Watergate were sown, years before it happened. After his loss to John F. Kennedy in 1960, and his defeat in the 1962 California gubernatorial election, many thought Richard Nixon's career was over. He himself told the press, "You won't have a Nixon to beat anymore." But here's where the clever shift began. The context that saved him. The mid-1960s were chaotic. The Vietnam War was escalating. Student protests were raging in the streets. The assassinations of John F. Kennedy and then Robert F. Kennedy. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. A deep internal division in America. The country was weary of the turmoil. And here Nixon understood the moment. The silent majority strategy. He didn't try to win over the protesters. He didn't address the revolutionary students. He addressed what he called the silent majority. Americans who wanted order, stability, and respect for the law. His slogan wasn't revolutionary. It was simple. Law and order. This was a clever strategic move. He didn't change his personality. He changed his target audience. And in the 1968 election, he won the presidency by a narrow margin. But his message was clear. He was the man who would restore order. And so began a new chapter, a bold foreign policy, opening the door to China in 1972, a policy of détente with the Soviet Union. He returned not just as president, but as a president who wanted to reshape the world. And in 1972, he was re-elected with a landslide victory, winning 49 states. This wasn't a natural victory. This was almost an absolute mandate. And here lies the painful irony. When he reached the peak of his political career, he was simultaneously building the mechanisms that would bring him down. In 1972, during Richard Nixon's re-election campaign, 5 men were arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Watergate complex. They were planting listening devices. At first, it seemed like a minor issue, a failed spying operation. But here's the real question. Why would a president with a huge lead in the polls need to spy in the first place? The problem wasn't the break-in. The problem was what happened afterward. Instead of letting the investigation run its course, attempts at a cover-up began, paying hush money to those involved. Pressure on investigative agencies, using state resources to protect the campaign. And here's where it turned from an election scandal to a constitutional crisis. Nixon had ordered all his conversations in the White House to be recorded. He believed the recordings would protect him historically, but they became evidence against him. When the Supreme Court demanded the recordings, he tried to resist. Then, the court unanimously ruled against him in the case. United States versus Nixon. That verdict was a watershed moment. No one is above the law. 1974, the end before he was formally impeached by Congress. He resigned, the first U.S. president in history to do so. He didn't fall because he was stupid. He fell because he was smart enough to think he was smarter than the system. Watergate wasn't a fleeting moment of weakness. It was the result of a mind accustomed to seeing the world as a battlefield. And the harsh truth, the most dangerous thing about power, isn't corruption. It's the belief that you can control everything. And history doesn't bring down leaders just because of their mistakes, but because of the pattern they repeat to the end.